Hi, it's Beefy, and welcome to part 3 of how to create a Wibbly Wobbly Wheel Animation, the Octane Edition. Today we're going to be adding lighting and textures to our scene in Octane. If you'd like to follow along, then I suggest that you watch parts 1 and 2 first. But if you want to just learn about 3-point lighting and textures in Octane, then you can do that too. Before we crack on, I would like to welcome new viewers to the channel. If this is your first time here, then this is a place where I post tutorials, tips and other stuff. If you're into Cinema 4D, X Particles, After Effects and the like, then you're in the right place. I'm just sharing the knowledge that I picked up along the way. We're all constantly learning and it's great that we can do this together. If you haven't done so already, then please subscribe to the channel and tinkle the notification bell so you don't miss out on future uploads. You have nothing to lose. And if you like this video, then please give it a big thumbs up. It will help my videos get seen by the algorithm thingy. And in turn that will help others find my videos. And a big thanks to everyone who has subscribed and liked my videos. You guys are awesome, thank you. So without further ado, let's press on. So in this tutorial we're going to be creating a 3-point lighting setup to light our scene. You may know what 3-point lighting is or you may not, so I'm going to explain this quickly for those who don't. 3-point lighting is a traditional method for lighting scenes in photography and film. The lights are positioned so the subject is lit from 3 distinct positions. And the sources we use are called the key light, fill light and backlight, which is also known as the rim or hair light. The key light is a primary light and is generally the brightest light source, and this gives the scene its overall exposure. The fill light is generally positioned on the opposite side of the camera and fills in or softens the shadows that are created by the key light. And the backlight is positioned behind the subject and this creates a rim of light on the subject. This will help the subject pop by pushing the subject away from the background, giving us a sense of depth. If you Google 3-point lighting you can find many examples. You can see the general setup from these diagrams. The setup isn't carved in stone and every one of these articles in Google search will tell you something different. To get a good understanding about lights in a scene, the next time you watch your favourite drama or film, make a note of how the scenes are lit. You'll be surprised on how different they are to these examples. Another good source for lighting setups is in the real world. There's some great photography and film tutorials out there, so check them out. It's best to learn the fundamentals first, understanding how light and shadows work. Once you get a grasp of it all, then you can start experimenting and bend the rules. And I say the term rules very loosely. Basically, it all depends on your subject and how you want your scene to look and feel. Okay, so I just jumped into Cinema 4D and I'm using Cinema 4D R26, and this is how our project was left at the end of the last tutorial. And I've added a couple of things since then, so I've added this backdrop here. So this is going to help us set up our scene, and I should be going through that later. And also, if I just come right in here, just come into polygon mode. I've made a polygon selection on our sphere here, so this cutout is going to have a different material to the sphere, and this material is going to match the material on the wibbly wobbly wheel there. And also I made my camera visible in our scene, and this is going to be my reference for setting up the lights. And I've added a Octane camera tag to my camera here later for when I render. So I made some changes to my track, and if you remember from the first tutorial we cloned the track sweep to make the track longer. In this project I noticed that there were ultra fine gaps in between the clones, which showed up in my test renders. So what I did instead was to take the track sweep out of the cloner object and I cloned the track spline instead. Then I made the cloner object a single object by right clicking and selecting connect objects and delete, and then I closed the gaps in the spline using the weld tool. And then I just dropped the new spline into the track sweep, and then I had a track without any gaps. Generally you should be fine, but if you notice any gaps in your track in the render, then this is a quick and easy fix. So I still have everything in layers here in my object manager, and I've got a new null here which is my lights, and I have 2 nulls in my lights null, and these are going to be my targets for my lights. So this is going to help me set up my lights. Just come to the top view here. we can see where these targets are positioned. So the 3-point target has the same coordinates as the wheel control, and the backdrop target is situated in the middle at the back of the backdrop there. I like to use nulls instead of objects for the targets because you can fine-tune the position of your lights there. If you use your object as a target, it's going to be difficult to make any changes later on in your project. So I have my live viewer. This has been docked into my interface here, and before I turn that on, I just want to change some settings. So I'm using direct lighting to render my project here. Generally, if I'm using an HDRI, I'll be using path tracing, but because I'm using area lights to light the scene, I'm going to use direct lighting. I just find it works better in this mode here. And I'm just going to make sure that my GI mode is in diffuse. And I'm going to leave everything else as default there. So I'm going to keep the max samples at 128 at the moment, just so that we can move quickly through this project. But later on, when we look at our final render there, I'm just going to increase the max samples. I like to switch my camera views in the viewport here, but sometimes this doesn't work with Octane. It kind of loses connection there. So I'm just going to be using my camera in my object manager. I'm going to fire up my live viewer now. So this is my scene being viewed by the camera. And at the moment we've got default lighting in our scene, so I want to control that. So I'm just going to bring in a texture environment. And this texture environment, I'm just going to come to the tag here. I'm going to make sure that the type is primary environment. And in the texture we have an RGB spectrum. And I'm just going to come into that. And I'm just going to play with the value here. And if I change this value, this is going to brighten our scene, and 100% is fully lit, and with 0% the lights are turned off. So I'm going to leave these switched off, but I'm going to be adding a little bit of ambient light back into our scene later once I set my lights up. I'm just going to change the name of this to light control. And then I'm just going to drop that into my lights null. And with my backdrop target null selected, I'm going to bring in my first light. And this light is going to light the backdrop, if you haven't guessed already. And I'm going to select an Octane targeted area light. So this has applied the target to my light. And this is referencing my backdrop target there. I'm just going to change the name of this light to backdrop. And I'm going to pop that into my lights null, and it's going to be next to my backdrop target there. I'm just going to scoot this over and make some room. And I'm going to come into my top view. And this is where my light is positioned. I need to scoot this over to my backdrop here. So I'm just going to bring this around like so. And I'm going to come to my side view. And I'm just going to bring this up to this top corner here and pull that back, just so we don't get too much of a speckler in the corner there. So what I'm doing with this light is I'm kind of setting up the scene. So I want to make this scene a little bit dramatic. So I'm going to contrast lights and shadows to make this look a little bit more dramatic. And with this backdrop here, I've just added a gradient to our scene. This is going to help me add some contrast to our scene here. So this is the darkest side of the gradient here. And the key light is going to be on the left hand side, and it's going to light the sphere. And this is going to be the brightest part of our subject here. And that's going to contrast with the darkest side of the gradient. And on this side is going to be the fill light. So this is going to be soft light. So this is going to be darker. And then this is going to contrast with the lighter side of the background here. You'll see how it works when we put this all together. But this is really going to help me contrast the lights and shadows, and it's going to make this subject pop from the background there. So at the moment this light is lighting our sphere and wheel and track, and I don't want this to be part of my 3-point light setup, so I want to exclude these objects from that light. And usually in Cinema 4D and Redshift you can use the project tab here and you can exclude objects from your light. So if I just take the track control here and drop that into here, this isn't going to exclude the track control from the light. So what we need to do is we need to do something different. And if we come into the Octane light tag here of the light and come to the bottom, we have a light pass ID. And by default, every light you bring in is going to be 1. So we can use this information to exclude objects from this light. So if I come to the track control and I right click and come to the Octane tags and I bring in an Octane object tag. In this tag here, in the object layer, at the bottom here we have use lights pass mark disabled. If I enable that, this gives us the option of excluding and including objects in lights. So if I come to the backdrop light here, I'm going to change the light pass ID to something unique like 8. And if I come into the object tag on the track control here, if I deselect 8, then this is going to exclude it from that light. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this tag now. I'm going to hold down Control. I'm going to drag this onto the sphere geo, onto the wheel cloner, and onto the spoke sweep. So everything here is now silhouetted. It's not being affected directly by this light. There's a little bit of light bounce from the backdrop, but that's okay. And also in the backdrop light here, just come to the Octane light tag again. I want to deselect cast shadows. I don't want this light to be casting any shadows, so I'm just going to uncheck that. And if I come into my scene objects here, I'm just going to apply this tag onto my backdrop. So I'm going to hold down Control and drag it onto there. And I want to reverse this selection here. So I want to turn everything off. And now the backdrop isn't going to accept any light from any other source. Only number 8. So this is one of the ways I'll work. If I'm bringing several lights into a scene, then I like to set this up from the get-go in Octane, because it gives me the option of excluding and including lights later on in the project, and it makes it easier to set up lights, and I should be showing you this later. But if you set this up from the get-go, it's going to be a lot more simpler and a lot more easier to get your head around than trying to do this later on in the project. So now I've got this all set up, I'm just going to bring in my first light for my 3-point lighting. I'm just going to select the 3-point target null here, and I'm just going to bring in another area light. And again, this is going to be targeted. And now this is in our scene and it's facing our target. So I want to change the shape of this. So I want to make this light spherical. And if I use a disc, this looks low polyed, and this can show up in your reflections and your specular, and it looks a little bit weird. So I like to use sphere, and this is a lot more spherical here. And I'm just going to leave everything as default here, so the size of it, and also if I come into the light settings, I'm just going to keep the power at 100 and everything as default there. So I'm just going to scoot this right over here, and I'm just going to come into the top view here, and we can see our light is situated here right in front of the camera. And I'm just going to move this over to about 45 degrees from the camera here. So I'm just going to take this light and I'm just going to scoot this over here. So this is lighting the sphere from the left hand side here, and that's looking okay for the moment. So I'm going to be making some changes. Before I make any changes now, I'm just going to rename this light, and I'm going to call it key, ID 1. So I'm going to be using, for this light, this is going to be light pass ID 1. And for the backdrop light, I'm just going to rename this one to backdrop ID 8. This will help me identify the lights and what the light is lighting and which ID number it is in the object manager. So I'm just going to drop this key light next to the 3-point target null, and now we're good to go. So what I want to do is I want to create some contrasty shadow on this sphere here, and I want the shadow to be at the bottom here. So this is going to be like a crescent of a shadow, and this is going to lead up into the rim of the backlight there. And at the moment our light is looking up at our sphere here, so I want to raise this up so we get the shadow on the bottom here. So I'm just going to bring that right up here. And this works really well with this model because this is spherical mostly, and this will add a little bit more drama to the scene here. I'm going to scoot down the timeline here. Just going to look at my shadows on my wheel. So I want to light a little bit more on this side here, so I'm just going to scoot this over. I want this shadow of the wheel to be a little bit further onto this right hemisphere here. So I'm just going to just pull this over a little bit. That's good there, I like that. So we've got this beginning of this shadow at the bottom here. So when I bring in my fill light, this is going to soften these shadows here. And I'm going to position the fill light so that we get this shadow at the bottom of this sphere here. So this is hard light. So this is a smaller light source, and this is going to be the strongest light. And this is creating some nice umbra shadows at the bottom here, which is sharp shadows. And in the fall off of the light here on the sphere on the right hand side, we've got some nice soft feathery shadows. So that's looking good, I quite like that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to bring in my fill light. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this light over, hold down Control, and just bring that to the other side here. So our camera's in the middle here, and this is how we're going to contrast these two lights. So this is going to be hard light, this is soft light, and as you can see that this is already softening the shadows of the key light there. But I want to make some changes because this light is literally doing the same thing as this light here, so I want to soften this up. So I'm going to change the name of this light to Fill. And I'm going to call this ID 2. And I'm going to change the light pass ID to 2. And I'm just going to pop this up underneath my key ID 1. And I'm going to change some details here. So I want to change the error shape to rectangle again. And I want to make this large. So I'm going to go 400 to 1000. So I made this bigger now, so this has increased the power of our light. And that's because I have surface brightness checked. If I have this unchecked, then the power of the light is going to be exactly the same. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to leave this checked. This will help me contrast the light a lot better. If I have surface brightness unchecked, then I won't be able to have much contrast between the lights. So I'm going to decrease the power here. I'm going to decrease this to something like 15. There you go, that's looking better there. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the position of this light here, and at the moment it's kind of looking straight on at the sphere, so I want to raise this up some more just to create some more shadow at the bottom here. At the moment I'm just going to turn off my key light, and then we can see exactly how this light is affecting this object here. So as you can see, we've got some nice soft light here, and that's because this is a bigger light source and the power is lower. So we get some nice feathery penumbra shadows there. Really softens up the scene, and I like that. So I'm just going to raise my light up, and as I raise my light up, we can see we're getting this shadow at the bottom here. I'm kind of concentrating on the right hand side here. What's happening on the left hand side is going to be drowned out by the key light, but it's this part here that I'm really interested in. So this is really going to contrast with the rim of light that the backlight's going to produce, and this is going to lead into that, and it's going to look nice. I'm just going to bring this up a little bit further, and maybe just bring this around a little bit. That's looking good there, I like that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring in my backlight, and I'm just going to turn on my key light here, and with the key and the fill light working there, this is looking quite nice. I like that. So I'm going to use the key light to create my backlight, so I'm just going to select that. I'm going to hold down Control again. I'm going to drag this to the other side. And we can see here that we're getting this rim of light now on our sphere. And this is visible in our render here, and I'm going to turn that off in a moment, but I'm just going to leave that on so you can see how I'm positioning. This is going to be easier for you to see. So I'm just going to come to the side view here, and you can see that we're looking up at the sphere. I'm just going to raise this up here. And that's kind of looking good there. So I'm just going to turn off the key and the fill here, and we can see exactly what's happening here. So I'm just going to scoot down the timeline. Going to see how this is affecting our object here. And I like that, that's looking good. And I'm just going to change the name of this quickly. I'm going to change the name of this to Back ID 3. So I'm going to change the light pass ID to 3, and I'm going to come into the visibility of my Octane light tag here, and I'm just going to uncheck camera visibility, and also I'm going to uncheck shadow visibility. So I don't want this light to be casting any shadows on the backdrop here. So I'm just going to turn on my lights now, and we're going to have a look at this and see how this is looking. And that's looking really good there. So I have some nice rim light, and the shadow is leading into that. I really like that. And I've got some nice soft shadows. I've got some hard light from the backlight there, but this has been softened by the fill, and this is looking good. And basically this is your 3-point lighting setup. Now of course we haven't got any materials on our scene at the moment, so this is going to look a lot different once we start adding materials. So we're going to start having to adjust our lights, and we're also going to have to adjust our materials so that the lights and materials work together. But this is a good start, I like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring in some materials. So I'm going to start with a PBR material, and this is a material that I downloaded from Ambient CG. So before I bring that in, I'm just going to turn off my wheel, and I'm going to turn off my spokes. And also I'm just going to come into my default camera here. No, it's still not working. And I'm just going to scroll right in here, so we can see our surface better. So I'm going to be using the Octane Universal material. So I'm just going to create one of these, and I'm just going to rename this as Sphere Geo. And I'm just going to drop that straight onto my Sphere Geo here. And I'm going to open up my node editor here. Make this kind of nice and big so you can see. So I like the universal material. It has a lot of things that you can play with here. So you can create some decent metallic materials out of this, and it works really well with a PBR material. And this is the material that I downloaded from Ambient CG. So I'm going to leave a link in the description if you want to play with this. So this is a nice material. It's got some wear and tear on it, and this is going to show up nicely in our specular and in our lights and shadows there. And you can color this material using the color correction node, or you can just use some color in your lights, and this works really well with that. So that's what I'm going to be doing later. So these are the bits and pieces that you get when you download your material. So you get your color, displacement, you have two normals, and we're only going to use one normal, which is normal GL. And also we have our roughness. So I'm not using a displacement in the final material. I'm just going to show you how this material will project onto our sphere geo here. So I'm just going to pop my displacement straight into my node editor here. And I'm going to change the legacy gamma to 1 and also the type to float. I want to pipe this into my displacement, so I need a displacement node. So I'm just going to bring one of these in. And in this displacement node, I'm going to use texture displacement. I'm going to change the height to 1. And I'm going to bring up the level of detail because I'm using a 4K material here. And that should do it. So I'm just going to pipe the image into the texture and the displacement into the displacement. And there you can see this is how our material is projecting onto our sphere geo. And it looks really, really shoddy. We've got lots of artifacts happening along the edges. There's lots of stretching going on this model here. And we need to do something different. So you wouldn't be wrong in thinking that we need to change the projection. Just come into the material tag. We can change the projection from UVW mapping to something like cubic. And cubic's going to try and do a good job. And you can see there that it's really sorted out these artifacts on the edge here. But you can see here that this doesn't blend in properly. So what the cubic is trying to do is trying to project the image onto different planes. But it isn't blending between each plane. And what I'm going to use is I'm going to use a triplanar. And the triplanar does a better job than the cubic. It does pretty much the same thing, but it really blends well. So I'm just going to pop this back into UVW mapping. And I'm just going to disconnect my displacement here. So I'm done with that. I just wanted to show you how this material was going to project onto our sphere geo here. Because with a triplanar, this isn't going to work with displacement anyway. So even if I wanted to, I can't use the displacement in the final material. So I'm just going to delete that. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to bring in my UV grid image. And I'm just going to pipe that straight into my albedo. And you can see we've got the same problem here. These artifacts happening down the edge here. If I scroll around my sphere here, you can see we've got lots of stretching going on. And this isn't looking good at all. So if I pop that into cubic, we can see that it's trying to do a good job. But when it comes down to blending, it's not doing a very good job. So if you have something that's really, really detailed, cubic isn't going to work for you. So we need to use a triplanar. So that's what I'm going to do now. I'm going to bring in a projection node. And I'm just going to pipe that into my projection. Nothing's happened at the moment. We need to make some changes. So by default we've got Mesh UV. I'm just going to change this to Triplanar and everything disappears. And that's because we need to bring in another node, and I need to bring in a Triplanar node. Scoot everything over a little bit. Make some room. So with the Triplanar, by default you have a blend of 5 and single texture is checked. And the Triplanar is really good because you can actually display different images into different planes. And to do that you just have to uncheck single texture and have the option of applying a different image into each plane. So I can just take that into X+. I'm going to put the Triplanar into the albedo. And if I scroll around, you can see the X+ plane there. And this is what our image is being projected onto. And you can see there's no stretching. It's looking really good. So if I just take this and pop that into my Y+, so now you can see that this image is being projected onto the Y+ there, and we've got some nice blending going on between our planes here. That's looking good. This material isn't ideal for a Triplanar, but I'm just showing this. It's easy to show exactly what's going on here. So I'm just going to bring the blend angle up to say something like 10. And we've got a very subtle material, so this should be good. And I'm going to disconnect Y+. And I'm going to check single texture. So as I scroll down the timeline here, you can see this is working like so, and this is really, really handy. So this cuts out a lot of headaches when you're trying to project through the material tag. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to disconnect the image here, and I'm going to delete that. And I'm just going to copy out the Triplanar 3 times. So I'm just going to bring in my PBR material. So first is the color, and next is my roughness, and then my normal GL. Now with these images here, with an RGB image, make sure that your legacy gamma is 2.2 and your type is normal. And the same with your normal map there, 2.2 normal. But with your roughness, so like roughness and displacements, etc., like black and white images, just make sure that the legacy gamma is 1. And I'm going to change the type to float. So this is going to help Octane read the information in this roughness, and it's going to display correctly. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to use the projection node here, and I'm just going to pipe that into each of these images here. And now I'm going to connect the dots. So the RGB color goes into X+, and that goes straight into the albedo. The roughness goes into X+, and this goes straight into the roughness. And the normal goes into X+, and this goes into normal. And that's all you have to do. That's looking good there. So the speculorism is showing up here at the moment, and I need to do a couple of things more. So I'm going to come into the basic tab here, and your BRDF model, I'm going to change that from Octane. I'm going to change that to GGX. This is going to be more accurate with specular and reflections there. And that's looking good. So I'm going to come into the IRR tab, and IRR is the index of refraction. So this is very, very important for reflections. It's not just for refraction. And with plastics are kind of around about 1.5 to 1.6. So I need to change the IRR here. So at the moment the IRR is 1.3. I'm just going to change that to say 1.5. And there we go. So we get a bit more specular happening there, and you can see the detail now of our material. That's looking good. So it all depends on what type of plastic that you are creating. And there's a good site, I'm going to show you that later. There's a good site for getting your index of refractions, but I'm going to be showing that later when I create my metal material. And this is our sphere geo here. This is looking good. So I'm just going to turn my wheel cloner back on and my spoke sweep back on. And there you go, this is looking good. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a metallic material for our wheel here and for our cutout. So I'm going to create another material, and this is going to be universal again. And I'm going to call this wheel cutout, and I'm going to just pop that onto my wheel cloner and my spoke sweep for the moment. So this is going to be a simple material, so I'm going to create a aluminium material, or aluminum, or wherever you are in the world, however you pronounce it. And so I'm going to create a metallic material here. So I'm just going to come into my attributes of my material. So I'm just going to come to the metallic tab here, and I'm just going to bring that right up. So now we have metal. And to get this a little bit more accurate, I'm going to come into the index of refraction again. And we have these fields here. So dielectric is now redundant. So we're just using metallic refraction mode and metallic IRR. So I'm going to be using RGB IRR. And if I just turn that on, this just kind of turns our metal black there. So we need to add some values here for the red, green and blue. And to achieve that, I'm going to use this site that I like a lot. So this is the RefractiveIndex.Info, and this is a really, really good site, and you can get all kinds of information about different kinds of materials and stuff. But for us, we're going to be using the 3D selected data for 3D artists. And in the book here, you can choose whatever medium you're going to be using, whether it's liquids or crystals, etc. We're using metals, and in the metals we have some basic metals here that we can get some values for. I'm going to be using aluminium, and underneath here we have all kinds of information. So we have the refractive index and we have the extinction coefficient. I really like this site. It's really handy for 3D artists to find realistic values for the IRR and the extinction coefficient. And this enables us to create near enough accurate representations of real world materials. Of course, there are many wavelengths to take into consideration, but in the 3D world we only look at 3 values, which is RGB. Basically, we can create a near enough accurate edge tint to our metals, like gold for example, which has a specific colour, and that's down to which wavelengths of the spectrum we see. This gives the metal its distinct colour, and if we view the metal from a different angle, we'll see other wavelengths, and that's the edge tint. Using the values from the site will help us achieve that. So we have 2 values here. We have the refractive index and extinction coefficient. And the refractive index is basically the reflection value of the wavelength. And the extinction coefficient is basically how much of that wavelength is absorbed by the material. And this gives the metal its Fresnel reflection. So if you look at a metallic object from a certain angle, you see the difference in the reflection towards the edges. I'm not going to get into this too deep, and there's some great reading material out there if you really want to get geeky on the subject. So I'm using the IRR RGB values, but if you're just going to be using the artistic or the IRR plus color, then you just have 2 values to enter. One is the refractive index and the other is the extinction coefficient. And to get those numbers, you just need to come into the line select. And in this menu here, you can choose different wavelengths. The wavelength that you're going to need is D, which is a basic refractive index and extinction coefficient. So you're not going to get an accurate edge tint with these figures here. So I'm using RGB, so I need to put the wavelength of RGB into this field here. So if I pop in 0.65, which is red, these are the values for the red wavelength there. And if I pop in 0.55, that's the values for green. And if I pop in 0.45, that's the values for blue. As I said, there's many wavelengths in the spectrum and we're just using RGB. So these are the values that we need to put into the wavelength. So all I need to do is just like pop in the wavelength I want, take these two figures and pop them into my material. So that's what I'm going to do now. So I'm going to start off with 0.65 and that's the red value. So I'm going to take the refractive index figure and I'm just going to pop that into this field here, the first one. And then I'm just going to take the extinction coefficient and this goes in the second field here. So now we can see that we're getting the red values from our material here. So I'm just going to do the same thing for the green and the blue. And there we go, we have our aluminium. We just come into the default camera here. Just come right in here, we can see this is our material here. So I'm going to change the roughness of this, and first of all I need to change the BRDF model, and I'm just going to change that to GGX so that we're going to have an accurate specular and reflection there. And I'm just going to come into the roughness and I'm just going to change that to say 0.2. Let's try that. So that's looking good there, I like that. So we've got some nice defined specular there and we have some nice smoothing of our reflections there. That's nice, I like that. I'm just going to come into my camera and we can see how this is looking, and that's looking quite smart, I like that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to add this material to our cutout. So I'm just going to apply that to my sphere geo. And I'm going to use my selection tag and drop that into my selection field. So there we go, that's looking quite nice. So I'm going to create another metallic material for our track here. I'm just going to use the same material for speed. I'm just going to name that to track. And I'm just going to drop that onto my track control there. And now we have our material on our track here, and that's looking pretty smart there. I just want to come into my track material and I'm just going to change the roughness. I'm just going to bring that up to 0.3. And there you go, that's looking quite smart, I like that. I think that complements the wheel and cutout there quite nicely, just to have a similar material there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to add a material to our background here. So I'm just going to create another material, and this one's just going to be a diffuse material. I don't want any specular in my background there. And I'm just going to rename this backdrop. And I'm going to drop that onto my backdrop. Just close all these up here. So I've got my backdrop here, so I'm just going to drop that onto my backdrop. And in the material, I can just play around with the value here. So I can just come to the diffuse here and I can just play around. At the moment it's about 95%. I can just bring that down, or I can just bring that right up. I think around about 95% is pretty good. So at the moment this is looking very monochrome, sort of like black and white, very noir. So I'm just going to add a little bit of colour to this. But what I'm going to do first is I'm going to sort this specular out on the quarter here. And if I just come back to the point where I can see my wheel. And I'm just going to come into my lights here. So I'm just going to come into my back ID3. And I'm just going to come to the Octane light tag in the light settings, and I'm just going to change the power of this. I'm just going to bring that down to 10. And this has calmed this specular down a little bit, and that's looking okay. I want to make this a little bit more defined on the edge here. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to create another light. So this is the advantage of setting up your Octane object tags and your light IDs. So this is going to be easy for us to duplicate this light and then assign different objects to those lights. So I'm going to duplicate this. I'm just going to switch back ID3 off for the moment, and I'm just going to call this ID4. And also I'm going to assign different objects to these lights. So the back ID4 is going to be the wheel and the track. So I'm just going to add wheel, track. So we know which ID it is and which objects are going to be affected by that light. And this one here, I'm just going to add sphere. So if I come into my IDs now, so the track here, I want to turn off back ID3 sphere. So I come into the object tag on my wheel cloner, I'm going to switch off 3 as well, and also in the spoke sweep here. And there's one thing I forgot to do is I need to change the ID number of the light here. So now this is illuminated again there. And if I come into my sphere geo object tag here, I'm going to switch off number 4. So now that's not being illuminated by this back ID4 wheel track. So I'm going to switch it off for the moment, and now I'm going to switch on my ID3, and we can see now that light is just illuminating the sphere geo. So this is now ignoring the wheel and track. So now I can just play around with my lights here. So I'm just going to come into my top view here, and I'm just going to bring this light in a little bit. Just so that I can get this specular, a nice big specular there. And I'm just going to turn the power down to, say, 4. And that's looking pretty good there. So we've got our shadow here, and that's leading into our specular, and that's looking really, really cool. That's looking really cool. I like that. So now if I just turn my back ID4 wheel and track on. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change the position of my light here in the back ID4 wheel track, and I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger. So I'm just going to say 250 by 250 by 250. And I'm just going to change the position a little bit as well. So if I come to the side view here, and I'm just going to bring this up, and I'm just going to change the power, and I'm going to bring that up to, say, like 80. There you go, that's looking good there. So I like that. So now we have control over the specular on the sphere and the specular on the wheel here, and that's looking pretty cool. I like that. So there's lots of things you can do with lights, and you have a lot of control. And I know the object tag and the light ID is a little bit finicky, but if you set this up from the start, assign different IDs to your lights and then different object tags to your objects, then you're going to have a little bit more control, and it's going to be easier to change things. So if you need to exclude lights and include lights, it's going to be a lot easier for you to manipulate. So if you set this up from the beginning, then you don't have any problems along the line. But it's a kind of bends your mind a little bit if you start deciding to add object tags and IDs, etc. It can bend your mind a little bit, and it can get confusing. If you set the system up in the beginning, then it's going to be easier to manipulate. So I always do that if I know I'm going to bring in more than 2 lights. So what I want to do, I'm just going to scoot this over and have a look, is this side isn't popping enough for me, and I want to add another backlight just to give a little bit of an accent on this top quarter here. I'm just going to come into my top view. I'm going to take the back ID3 sphere, and I'm just going to hold control and copy that around. So now we have this specular on the left hand side here. If I just come into my side view here, I can just move this around. But I want this to affect the track and the wheel here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come into my light here, and I'm just going to change that to ID 5. And I'm just going to put left hand side or left, so I know what's what. And I can just change the light pass ID to 5. And now we're getting some nice specular on our track here. And if I just move this down a little bit, we can see we're getting some nice light on this side of the wheel. So I don't want this to be so strong. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to just pop this up here with the other lights. I'm just going to change the power, and I'm just going to change this to something like 2. Just so that we get a little accent there. Just going to bring that in a little bit and maybe around a little bit. There you go. And I'm probably going to pop the power down to 1. There you go. That's looking quite smart there. So as I said, this is looking very monochrome and stuff and that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of color. And the way I'm going to do that is through the lights. So I'm just going to come to the fill light, and this is what I'm going to change first. And I want to warm this side up a little bit. So I'm just going to change the temperature. I can actually add a RGB spectrum into the texture, and I like to do that, but for time I'm just going to change the temperature here. So I'm just going to bring the value down, and if I bring the value down to the lowest, you can see that we're bringing lots of red into our spectrum there. I only want to warm this up a little bit, so I'm just going to choose a value that I like. There you go. So we've got some nice warmth coming into the side of our sphere here. So if you look at the color wheel, blues and oranges are opposite each other, and that happens in real life. So if you look at the lights in your room, you're going to find that some are more orange and some are more blue, and they're very good for contrasting with each other. So I have like a little bit of orange here in our sphere. I'm actually going to just probably bring in a little bit more orange just to warm that up a little bit more there. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to come to the back ID3 sphere, which is the light that's lighting here, and I'm just going to add a little bit of blue. So if I just bring that right up, you see that we're getting blue in our light there. So I just want to bring that down to say something around about there. I just want this very, very subtle. And I'm just going to do the same with the back ID 4. So let's just bring down so we can see the specular in the wheel there from that light. And I'm just going to bring this up. And we're getting some nice blues in there on the wheel and on the track. That's looking quite smart there, I like that. Probably bring it down a little bit, just so that we get a little hint there. And on this specular here, on the back ID left, I'm just going to make that a little bit more orange. Something like that. That's looking quite smart. And then in the backdrop, if I just come to my material in the backdrop, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a small value of blue in the backdrop there. And this is to match the blueness in the specular here on this side. And I think that's looking pretty smart. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to come to my, just close everything up here. And I'm just going to come to my camera. And I'm going to come to my camera tag here. And in my camera imager, I'm just going to enable the camera imager. And I'm just going to enable denoiser. Just so that we can get a nicer render here so we can finish off this tutorial. And just turn on the main tab here. And that's looking quite smart, I like that. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to come into my lights here, and in my light control, which is come into my RGB spectrum here, I'm just going to change this value a little bit. So I'm just going to bring this up. Not a lot. So if you bring this up too much, you're going to kind of wash everything out. I'm just going to change this just a little bit so that we can smooth out some of these shadows here. It's probably too high there. There you go, something like that. It kind of just adds a little bit of ambient light to our shadows there, just calms them down a little bit. So we're going to see what this looks like. So I'm going to speed through this again so you don't have to wait with me. Okay, so there you go. This is looking quite smart, and this is a good start. So we have a lot of control over our lights, and we can create some really nice scenes. So within Octane, we can actually think out of the box. If we use our object tags and our light IDs, then we can create something that looks really, really dynamic. And in the time it's taken me to record this tutorial, I think this is a pretty good start for a well-balanced scene. It's a little bit longer than I intended, but I really wanted to explain the lights and the shadows and the thought process on how and why I position the lights, and also how I set up my object tags and my light IDs. So the way these lights are set up is working really well with this model here. But every scene and subject is different, and you'll find that this setup won't work for you. So play around and solo your lights, watch for the shadows they create and how they react with other lights in the scene. The first light you create is the key light, and remember this light always sets the exposure for the scene. And it's all down to your materials as well, how you set up your materials. The other thing you can do is add some texture to your lights and create some variation to your reflections and specular. That's a topic for another day, but I think this is looking good so far. I'm going to make some changes and I'm going to show you the final render. But at the moment I'm just going to leave it as it is. So I'm going to leave this tutorial here. I could play with lights and materials all day, but as I say, your project isn't finished, it's only abandoned. During this tutorial I gave you a brief overview of the Octane Universal material. There's loads more to play with and discover. The materials I created are really simple and they work really well with this scene, but obviously you can add a lot more detail if you need to. The main thing about this material I like is that you can get really geeky and really nerdy and detailed with this material, or you can just be really artistic. And I like it a lot. So I hope you learned something today that you can take away and apply to your future projects. And if you like this tutorial, then give it a big thumbs up. Thanks for stopping by, and I shall see you in the next video. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Hopefully what I've shown you today will help you in your future projects. If you like what you've seen, then please give this video a big thumbs up. Like, subscribe and tinker that notification bell so you don't miss out on future content. It will help the YouTube algorithm thingy help others find my content. Also, you can check out my latest experiments, concepts and dailies on Instagram at Almost Daily Render. And as always, any feedback and questions, please leave them in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and if you have any problems, I'll be glad to help. And while you're here, you can check out my other content. Thanks for watching, and I shall see you in the next video.